Well, he stopped, he was obviously on his way to bed.
You don't want that lamp.
He stopped and talked with us till 1:30 in the morning.
Oh, wow.
And it was just, it was
Mhm.
Florida State, grabbing a hold of Dave Merrill. And just, now he stopped and spent the time with us like that. Now,
Okay.
So we're rolling, so anytime you're ready.
Okay, let's do it.
all right. Well, I'm delighted, Dr. Russell, that you're here.
Okay, sorry. I'm sorry. Let me fix.
Okay.
Use the question and I'll pick it up.
Well, I certainly can
Project.
That's, I don't have a problem with that. Well, I'm delighted that you're here, willing to invest your time not only for us here at Florida State, but for students across the country today, tomorrow, and 10 years from now. And I think it's important that that we feel you're part of the family here at Florida State. So I'd like you to, to start by telling us a little bit about your journey, your pilgrimage, how you got to where you are today.
Well, as far as my professional career, I started out as a high school math and science teacher, had the opportunity to teach part-time at a local university, and I was teaching in physics at that time. And, talk about struggling graduate students today. I didn't realize it at the time, but people probably thought I was struggling then, because for a while I taught high school in the morning, I taught at the university in the afternoon, and I worked on my master's degree in the evening. And what teaching high school and college side by side allowed me to do was to realize I liked the freedom and flexibility of the college environment, where before I'd thought totally I would retire as a high school teacher. And so deciding I might want to pursue teaching at the college level, I went to Indiana University to get my union card, if you would, my doctorate, and then from there took a one-year postdoc position at Purdue University. My wife really didn't want to go there. She had lived in North Carolina before we were married and wanted to go back to that area, and I was amenable to that, but I said, Nancy, we can go to Purdue. It's just 1 year. You can put up with anything for 1 year, and that was 1970. We haven't left. And while at Purdue, I worked with Dr. Sam Postlethwaite, who was the founder of the audio tutorial system. And in fact, what attracted me there, he had a National Science Foundation grant and asked me to come on as an instructional developer and to coordinate instructional development. And so after I was at Purdue a year, a part-time position opened up in the Department of Education at that time, teaching media courses and such. So for a number of years, I worked part-time with Dr. Postlethwaite on the grant, part-time in Department of Education. And even after I finished the project with Dr. Postlethwaite, I enjoyed the instructional development, so went over to School of Nursing, helped them develop some courses in medical surgical nursing in the audio tutorial format, while continuing to teach in the Department of Education. When that project ended, I went to the Laboratory for Applications of Remote Sensing, which built upon my background in physics. We were developing materials for scientists who were going to take remote sensing technology and apply it to everyday applications. I liked the part-time developing materials, part-time teaching, and so when that project ended, I went to the Center for Instructional Services, where I work with faculty to improve their teaching all the time, continuing to teach in what is now the School of Education at Purdue.
What was it like being a graduate student at Indiana?
Well, at the time, I guess I didn't realize how fantastic it was, because I thought everybody had the caliber of people and the quality of people, like Ole Larson, who was chairman of the department, one of the founding fathers of the field. Mendel Sherman was there. John Molstad was there. Carolyn Gus was there. And some of the older viewers will realize how important these people were, maybe even had the chance to know them. For the younger people, it's just folks that we've just read about. In fact, Bob Heineck came to Indiana just as I was leaving. I met him, but never had the chance to work with him as a graduate student, but came back later on sabbatical and did work with him in writing a textbook.
You've talked about a number of people that were at some of the schools. tell us about who you would consider to be your mentor, and how that person meant to you.
That's a difficult question. I've had many mentors, high school teachers I can go back on. In fact, since I've been in Florida, have reconnected with one of my high school teachers who winters down in the southern part of the state. Certainly would consider Mr. Edler to be one of my mentors. I had many college professors. Dr. Lutz, who was in the physics department at Wittenberg University, where I did my undergraduate degree and where I taught for a while. He would be considered a mentor. And I would even think some of my colleagues in graduate school at Indiana. In addition to the faculty there, I think established relationships, for example, Siva Sailam Tyagarajan, better known as Tyagi and well known in this field, was a colleague of mine at Indiana University, and it wasn't until I left and realized how much of an influence he had, and that all graduate students didn't have colleagues like that. And certainly colleagues at Purdue University and here at Florida State have been real mentors. I guess if I had to pick one mentor, if I had to give an award, and that's always difficult to do, but pick the one, the person that probably had the most influence on my life as a teacher and an instructional developer was Sam Postlewaite, the developer of the audio tutorial system. Sam was a very caring, passionate person, taught me how to develop student-centered materials. In fact, he put students at the center of his professional life. And I remember the first time I went and met with Sam before I accepted the position, I was impressed by a sign that he had outside the door of his office that said, "Students, please come in, visitors will excuse you," which communicated a very strong message to me and to others that students did come first in his life. And he sort of took me under his wing as a colleague and almost like a father figure, and helped me learn how to relate to students in a different way. Even though I'd taught for 7 years before I met Sam, I saw that as a real turnaround in my attitude towards students. Not that it was poor in the past, but at least it was a different attitude. And working with him, developing materials. Sam never had an instructional development course, but I learned as much from him as a person than I did from all of the coursework that I'd had in the past.
Wow. What were some of the areas of your interest as a graduate student, areas that you worked on, and then as a faculty member? I suspect over the years your areas of interest have changed a little bit.
Yes, they have changed. I really started out at Indiana University co-teaching the programmed instruction course with Art Babick, who was a graduate of Syracuse, a new faculty member. Teaching the course with him, I guess a little humorous story that always comes to mind is we were teaching the course, and in the course we had a fellow from India who had just come over, could hardly understand him with his true English, I guess, and something with the Indian accent we didn't really understand. And as we started doing assignments, very quickly Dr. Babick and I realized that this fellow in the class knew more about programmed instruction than the two of us together. Turns out it was Tyagi, and he had come to this country, had been developing program materials in India. In fact, had interacted with Susan Markle, who's one of the founding mothers, if you would, of programmed instruction, and a gentleman by the name of Doug Elson on the psychology faculty at Indiana University, and which, by the way, B.F. Skinner had been on the faculty at Indiana at one time. And Doug Elson had discovered Tyagi and invited him to come to Indiana University, and as a part of that was working on doctoral courses, and ended up in Dr. Babick's and my class, and just impressed us. So we very quickly called him into the office and said, "Tyagi, we're going to be doing a project in this course. What would you like to do for your project?" Tyagi thought a minute, and in somewhat broken English that I really can't imitate, said, "I would like to program the course." And he did. Over that semester and the next, he put together essentially a program text titled Programmed Programming, which we started using in the course in a formative or tryout version that was later published by Tyagi.
Wow. You mentioned, you give us this story. Tell us some other stories that you have
Oh, I see. 30 years of history in the field, there are a lot of stories. One that I'm probably asked more than any other is about the Assure model, which is in the Instructional Media book. And people always want to know about the research background, the theoretical underpinnings of this Assure model. And so I'll tell you the truth here, expose kind of thing. The Assure model was developed on one hot August afternoon in Indianapolis, Indiana, on Mike Melenda's porch. Bob Heineck, Mike, and I were sitting around. We were in the process of putting together the first edition of Instructional Media. And I think it was Bob's idea, said, well, perhaps we need to look at a new utilization model for media, a media utilization model. And we also, in thinking of it, said, well, it probably, if we could come up with an acronym that would help students remember the model. And so, believe it or not, in about an hour or so, went through a few iterations, just sitting there on the porch sipping lemonade, the Assure model was born and hasn't changed since.
That's amazing. You made a reference to the book that you worked on, and certainly your book on instructional media is the premier book in our field and has been for some time. It's in the 6th or 7th edition?
6th edition now.
6th edition. Tell us a little bit about that book and how it came to be, and elaborate on the process that you went through in writing a book.
All right. Again, it's another one of those stories, and I could sit here all day and all evening telling stories. When I was at Purdue, this would have been back in the mid-'70s, a publisher came to me and said, would I be interested in developing a book on media utilization? I had done a couple smaller books before that time and realized I probably didn't want to do it myself. At that time, there was a book by Brown, Lewis, and Harkleroad, who had the lion's share of the market. But this company realized that they weren't always going to be around. In fact, at that time, I think one of them was retired, others were getting ready to retire. And so this publisher convinced me, said, if you develop a book now, you'll be sort of in the wings. And when they leave center stage, you'll be ready to come on. Your book will be established. So I thought about it, realized I didn't want to do it myself. It was a tremendous undertaking. I had, before that time, met Mike Melenda at Indiana University. He came after I left Indiana as a graduate student, but I'd met him at professional conferences like AECT, and turns out he and I were born literally days apart, both Scorpios, and everybody I talked to said, don't work with another Scorpio. But I thought, I'd contact Mike. I said, Mike, would you be interested in co-authoring this media book with me? And Mike thought a while and said, yeah, I think I would be, but it might help us in sales if we could get Bob Heineck, who was then immediate past president of AECT, head of the largest program at that time at Indiana University. And it happened that Bob was on sabbatical that semester, so Mike called Bob in Colorado and said, Bob, would you be interested in letting us use your name on this book? You don't have to do any work, but let us use your name and we'll give you a percentage of the royalties. And Bob thought a little bit and said, no, I don't want to do that. He said, I want to be involved as an equal author, equal partner, and do 1/3 of the work. And so Mike and I were a little bit surprised, but very, very pleased that Bob's willing to work with us. And then Bob said, well, I have a contract with John Wiley Publishers. He had signed with Judy Wiley, who at that time was very high in the company, but with other commitments, hadn't done anything on that. And so we thought, well, that's a great idea too. Plus, there was a sort of a $5,000 grant in aid. It wasn't advancing his royalty. It was $5,000 to start writing this book. And Bob hadn't done anything, hadn't spent any of that money. It was still there. And so the three of us very quickly came to an agreement, and it was decided I would go to Indiana University on sabbatical that year. I think that would have been 77, 78 academic year. And so we started writing the book. The process we used, and I, as you probably guessed, I'm a people person, a very collaborative person, like to work with others, and sharing the workload and such. So what we did was Mike, Bob, and I sat down and as a group, as a team, brainstormed what content we thought should go into the book. And once we did that, we tried to organize into chapters. And originally there were going to be 15 chapters in the book. And once we got into chapters, then we decided who would write which chapter. So there was one major author, if you would, for each of the chapters. But once a chapter was drafted, then all the other two authors looked at it, and we sat and came to a consensus in terms of what would be in the book. And then as we went to other editions, we tried to rotate the chapters so we'd get a new, fresh perspective each time. And then when Bob decided to retire several years ago, we realized with Bob retiring that we wanted to pick up another author, because one of the benefits of having three authors is there's never a tie. In fact, early on, the three of us decided 2 out of 3 wins. And so Mike and I might disagree on something, and if so, then Bob would make the final decision. And we also decided there would be no grudges, saying, well, remember last year you decided in my favor. No, there was none of that. It was whatever we decided, we moved ahead. So when Bob retired, we realized we needed to find another third author, and we literally went through a process probably more rigorous than any faculty search process I've ever gone through. The three of us sat down, came up with our criteria, what we wanted to find in that third author, and since we decided to go in alphabetical order, Hynek is really not a senior author, as often the case. As I said before, he had his equal share of contribution, so they were in alphabetical order, and I was quite comfortable with that. So Mike said that my main criteria had to be somebody whose last name came after Russell in the alphabet. That happened, but that wasn't the reason that it happened. So we talked to other people in the field, other professionals, in terms of who would they think could make a contribution. We were looking for someone to complement what abilities and skills Mike and I had, and after talking to, I don't know how many people, probably somewhere 75 different people, also talking with potential authors, we came down to a short list, just as they do in academic hiring, and from that short list, Sharon Smaldino sort of rose to the top, and we selected her, and now a couple editions later, we're very, very happy we did. She's fit right into the author team, in fact, even calls Mike and Bob and I the boys, so.
What would you say was is the, how would I say this, the greatest contribution that you feel that book offers?
Well, I think the contribution that it offers is that it puts together in a format different than in the past. At least when that book came out, it won many design awards and so forth, and we can't take total credit for that because, like in any team, whether it's a football team or whatever, there are a lot of people behind the scenes that never get the glory. And we've had a very good production team at Wiley originally, and of course, since then the book has been sold to other companies, and we're now with Merrill Prentice Hall. But I think the contribution that has made, or what has allowed it to make a contribution, is its format. And as Mike and Bob and I were thinking about what our vision of the book was, what we wanted to look like, it came to mind that perhaps we'd make it like a news magazine, like a Time magazine or a Newsweek. And so you notice there are sidebars and boxes and those kind of things, which back in the late 70s you didn't see in textbooks. Mm-hmm. In fact, one of my colleagues, I went up for promotion after the book came out, and it sort of helped push me over the top. One of my colleagues, I'm told in a confidential secret meeting of the promotion committee, said it looked like a high school social studies book. So we didn't take that as an insult, because if it did the job and allowed students to learn from it in a meaningful manner with a lot of visuals, illustrations, boxes, rather than just going through and reading text after text. Well, I think that's what's allowed it to be successful. And why it's successful, I guess I'm too close to it. I don't know. I would guess the input of Hynek and his leadership knowledge in the field, plus Mike Melinda and I, the upstarts and things that we thought should be there, and the fact that we were able to blend those in something that never been done before.
Tell us a little bit about for those that are not familiar with you and that are not around you will probably know you best for the Hynek Russell Melinda book. But tell us some of the other things that you're that you've done, if you will, some contributions that you've made in the field.
Okay. We have another book by a different author team. We have a team of 3 Purdue faculty and a former graduate student who's now at University of Northern Illinois, a book designed for pre-service teachers, freshman, sophomore level people going into teaching. And what we did in this book was try to combine instructional design, media, and computers. In the old days, back in the 70s, early 80s, we had 3 courses at Purdue. A course on media utilization, which used the Heineck book, a computer course. Computers were just coming on the scene in schools then. And we realized, even though we had a sort of dual level instructional design course, a Dick and Carey type course that could be taken as an upper level undergraduate or as a graduate, a lot of students didn't take that. Many of the teachers would come back at the master's degree level and take the course and say, gee, why didn't we have this as an undergraduate? And so as Tim Newby, Jim Lehman, and Don Steppich and I were thinking about it, we thought with the more and more pressures on teachers now, every teacher has to take a course in reading and special needs and on and on and on. There was no longer a place in the curriculum for multiple courses in what we would consider our field. And so we thought it'd be nice if we could put together one course. And so this book was really written for a course at Purdue, has now been published, and we're working on the 2nd edition. It's called Instructional Technology for Teaching and Learning. And I hope someday that will be as much of a contributor to the field as the Heineck book has. And a lot of people ask me, why did I write a book to compete with the Heineck book? Well, obviously I didn't. That was never my intent. That's misinterpretation of people out there. And to show you one of the reasons why it wasn't designed as a competitor, it's the same publisher. Or in fact, I would only work on the book as we conceived the 2nd book if the same publisher picked it up, because I didn't want publishers competing against each other. And just to set the record straight, as I said before, the Newby book, the Instructional Technology for Media for Teaching and Learning, is designed for beginning people in teacher education. They learn the basics of instructional design, selecting computer software, so when they get into their methods courses, they can apply those principles, and the teachers of the methods courses don't have to teach all the fundamentals. Where the Heineck book really is designed to be an upper level undergraduate or a graduate student text that focus specifically on media utilization, instructional technology, both the more traditional media as well as the new digital-based media.
What any words of wisdom for working with book publishers or working in that area?
I think experience has worked out, but a lot of the times we've maybe lucked into it, come up with good publishers. Contrary to what some of my colleagues would tell you, I've not had a bad experience with the publishers that we worked with. As I indicated, we started out with Wiley Publishers, and then they sold out their educational line to Macmillan. We worked with Macmillan for a number of years very successfully, and now we're with Merrill Prentice Hall. I think we probably have the strongest support team that we've ever had with the 6th edition of the Heineck book and the 2nd edition of the Newby book. So I wish I could give you some magic formula and such, but do pick your publisher carefully. Talk to authors who are currently working with that publisher. We didn't do that because Heineck already had a contract with Wiley, but if I were going to do that today, I would say talk with other authors who work with that publisher, get to know your editor and such, and then certainly it has to be a collaborative relationship. They can't expect you to do everything, and you can't expect them to do everything. And I'm sure if I were giving you advice from the publisher's point of view, try to stay on schedule, because that is the biggest problem they have working with faculty is many faculty kind of work at their own pace. They're used to that academic freedom. And so I think Heineck and Melinda would tell you that I've been the one to crack the whip on that team. And now with Sharon on board, she's more of a whip cracker too, I guess. But we make every effort to stay on schedule. And asking about stories here, if I were characterizing the Heineck, Melinda, Russell team. This is before Sharon came on board. If I could characterize this, and that's always dangerous, of course, I'm one that wants to get the job done. You know, make a commitment, get it done. You may sacrifice a little bit on quality, but get it done on time. Mike Melinda, on the other hand, is a perfectionist. I mean, he wants it done right and will work over it, rework it, and say to make it the best possible. And of course, as you can see right away, this causes conflict. Here's Russell out wanting to get it done on time and certainly with reasonable quality, but I may sacrifice a little quality. And here's Mike wanting to make sure it's perfect before anybody sees it. And Heineck's caught in the middle, and I once jokingly made the statement, I thought that Mike would put polish on a stagecoach to make it go faster, you know. So he just wanted to do it perfect. But I think it was this team, this blend, that I could not have done this myself. And I'll make assumptions here. I don't think Heineck could have done it himself. I jokingly say he had several years and didn't do anything on the book. And I think it's something that Mike could not have done by himself, but it's the idea that two or more heads are better than one, and working collaboratively and giving feedback to each other, and particularly if all the authors, as we were, are able to take that feedback in a constructive manner for the betterment of the project rather than worrying about individual egos and this kind of thing, and having a supportive staff there at the publisher to help you bring this off.
Your background, you have some experience in public education, and you've taught teachers, and you've been a teacher, and certainly growing up you've been a student. So from your perspective, as professionals in our field, what do you think we can do today to improve education?
That's a difficult question. I guess if I had all the answers, I probably wouldn't be sitting here. I'd be in Washington or someplace. But I think it's a very important question. As you say, I do come from a personal background in teaching. My daughter taught in public schools for a while. I have a sister still teaching in the public schools. I have a project at Purdue, a technology implementation project where we go out and work with teachers in the school. So I've been out there recently, and I don't like everything that I'm seeing. I think we're sacrificing a lot of the future of this country by not doing a better job in the public schools. And don't get me wrong, there are certainly some very, very good teachers out there, but all you have to do is talk to parents, talk to kids, and you find there are some situations that really could be improved. I think people in our field have tried to do things to improve the schools. In a lot of cases, I think the school has rejected people coming in from an instructional design, educational technology perspective. I think our best hope is getting the people in a pre-service environment, or while they're still learning to be teachers. And unfortunately, we know when they get in the schools, the veteran teachers oftentimes will coax them or coerce them to do it the old way, the way we've always done it. As far as I think the one change that could make the biggest effect would be if teachers' attitudes and school attitudes went from teacher-centered to learner-centered. And I think the best saying along this line is moving from the sage on the stage to the guide on the side. And many teachers haven't realized that when you're the sage, you're up there talking, you're presenting information. And we know from experience in our field that there are other media that can present that information more quickly, more realistically. I mean, in addition to just textbooks, you can read faster than you can listen. We've got videos, we got computers, we got all sorts of things out there that can present information. And so we need to change that teacher's role. And in addition, teachers don't know everything. When I was a high school student, or certainly an elementary school student, we thought teachers knew everything. And at that time, a few years ago, maybe they did know most of the information about physics or whatever it was I was studying. But now, as we know, information is changing so rapidly that the material on the internet and the web is more up to date than the teacher would know. And so if the teacher doesn't know the most recent developments, there's no way that they can present them. So let the students learn, from the internet, from the web. So if we change then from that sage on the stage to the guide on the side, then the teacher's role must change. And this is a role that I'm not sure a lot of teachers are able to deal with. They really haven't been trained. And this was, I think, going back to my experiences with Sam Postlethwaite, this is one of the things that he taught me, that as teachers, we're not presenting information. We're there as a colleague, as a guide, as a friend, as a mentor, the kind of words we're hearing today, certainly in higher education, and I'm not sure we're seeing them in the public schools. But that teacher needs to be there to guide and direct the student. If the student is being successful doing things well, that teacher needs to be there to provide the reinforcement and so forth. On the other hand, if the student is having difficulty, then the teacher needs to be there to provide that guidance and support, and not teaching, all the students as though they were the same. I can imagine back in cave people times that when it was all tutorial, the parents would work with the children, and somebody got the idea, let's take all of these cave children, whatever you call them, put them in one cave and treat them as though they were all alike. And unfortunately, to me, that's not progress, because we lost the identity of the individuals. Where now, I think we have the technology. We couldn't do, or at least I don't think we could do, true individualized instruction 30, 40 years ago. We just didn't have the technology to do it. But now we do it with computers, all sorts of digital media, the web and so forth, that now we can start looking at individualized instruction, or what I referred to earlier as student-centered instruction.
You mentioned that Sam Postlethwaite was your mentor, and how he really added to your feeling and passion about students.
Mm-hmm.
And so my question is, what advice do you have for graduate students today, and tomorrow? What kinds of things should they be doing? What kinds of things should they avoid doing? What would you?
Okay, I think in terms of graduate students, probably one of the best things graduate students can do is to try to get teaching experience, assuming they're going into teaching, while they're in graduate school. At Purdue, we work very hard to involve our students in teaching. I realize that a lot of places don't do that. And so even if your department doesn't have money for an assistantship or such, even if you have to volunteer to work with a faculty member whom you respect. And I know some students, even at Purdue, we only have so many assistantships. Everybody can't always teach, but I've had students that have volunteered to work with me or another faculty member. Or it's possible sometimes to pay them in course credit. They'll do it as a practicum or an internship. So I think as a graduate student, get the kind of experience that you want to have and do for the rest of your life. If it is doing research and whatever, then get experience doing that. My own experiences and experience many of my graduate students are that in graduate school, you don't know what you're going to be doing. So that's why I would recommend get experience teaching, get some experience doing research, and get some experience doing writing as a co-author with a faculty member. A lot of advantage to that. Mainly the faculty member can provide guidance and direction, hopefully if you pick the right person. Also, co-authored with somebody that's known in the field, it's more likely to be published. Unfortunately, it may be the same quality as if Jane Smith, as a graduate student, authored herself, and Jane Smith and Dr. Jones, but Dr. Jones's name on there, unfortunately or fortunately maybe, will help to get it published. So do get the kind of experiences that you want. Something I guess that I have done that's worked for me is follow your instincts. I think all too often we may listen to the professional guidance or what your mentors and what your colleagues, or in many cases your parents or spouse might be saying, but follow your own instincts. I'm a strong believer that we within ourselves find out which direction we ought to go, what we ought to be doing. And so it's the old saying, be true to yourself kind of thing. Do your own thing to an extent. Don't carry that to an extreme, but do listen to your mentors, get advice, but don't let them tell you what to do.
You mentioned earlier that you met to develop your book. you made some important connections at some of the conferences. In fact, I think you mentioned very early on at AECT, you met Mike Melinda, and,
Yes.
and that's where you started some of those. How important is it for graduate students and for professionals to be involved in the different type of professional conferences that we have in our field?
I think attending conferences are very, very important, not always so much from what you learn at a conference. And I know as a graduate student, I learned a lot. I mean, as I go now, and hope it's not egotistical, but I don't learn as much because I do tend to read more in the field, know people in the field, keep all what's going on. But at all stages of your career, from a beginning graduate student to a senior professor looking forward to retirement, I think the networking is the important thing. And what you described earlier, the idea of my meeting Mike Melinda there, that was one connection in a network. And so I think probably the most important thing is networking, because that's what's going to get you a job. The old saying, it's not what you know, but who you know. And I strongly believe in that, and being in the right place at the right time and meeting the right person, perhaps a chance meeting, will get you that job. The experience with Dr. Postlewaite, while I was at Indiana University, one of the faculty there was offering a summer workshop in Las Cruces, New Mexico. And I didn't know Sam Postlewaite, but somebody there did and thought Sam would be an excellent person to bring out for this conference. So I met Sam Postlewaite at a workshop or a conference that set together that network, put things in place that would take me to Purdue for 1 year in 1970, which 28 years later, I'm still there. So the networking is a very important part of conferences.
Knowing what you know now and through your experiences, what do you think you would do differently given the chance to do it again?
I can honestly say I wouldn't do anything differently. I guess I'm one that feels that with the mentoring I've had, the guidance and direction I've had, plus the grace of God, if you would, has allowed me to do the things that I've done. And so I, in retrospect, can't think of anything that I would do differently. I guess being a Presbyterian, I might call this predestination.
What in our field is changing so rapidly, and with the technology coming in. What excites you about our field?
I think the things that excite me most about the field at this time are the people involved in the field, plus the way that it is changing, the rapidity of change. I would never be one comfortable working on an assembly line. Likewise, I'm not comfortable teaching the same course the same way for 20, 30 years. I know some of my colleagues who are, but I won't mention any names. But I like the way the field is changing. I've been one of the slow learners or laggards in terms of the adoption model in terms of some of the technology. I was years before I had a VCR at home. Not that I was anti-VCR, but I guess just took a while, and so I do try to keep up to date on my teaching, and that's a real challenge because it is changing rapidly. The people there, I think, that certainly the people that I've met in the instructional systems, instructional design field are the finest people anywhere, and so that's what is exciting to me. And as I look more and more toward retirement, that's one of the things that I would miss the most, but I hope even in retirement to maintain these contacts with the people in the field. And I think as you approach retirement, maybe I won't be expected as much to keep up with all the changes in the field because they're getting more rapid all the time.
With you have a particular a unique perspective in that since you've been in the field, you've seen where we've come from. You've worked with these people who are founders of the field. You've watched us grow and been a part of our growth. Now, from this experience, what kind of predictions do you have for our future?
Okay, I think it's not my predictions as much as our predictions, because as Mike and Sharon and I are working on the 6th edition, we did a lot of work, particularly Mike, in terms of a lot of reading in the field, plus we all did self-reflections and even drew on some of the work that Don Ely has done in terms of the trends and futures in the field. So these aren't all Jim Russell's predictions. They are sort of the collective group of colleagues in the field. One of the things I see, and it's here now, is the converging of media. Back in the old days, even when I was a teacher, we had print in the form of textbooks. We had audio in the form of phonograph records, and audio tapes were just coming on the market then. We had our films and we had our real objects. Well, now it's difficult to separate them. As we've digitized the field, you can have in a computer, in a digitized format, all of those. You have your motion media, your text, your visuals, and even with virtual reality, you have your objects there, what appear to be objects. So I see one of the trends is the converging of media. In addition to converging, they're also evolving. And so who knows where they're going to go 5, 10 years, or maybe even next year from now. So that's one of the things that particularly I've noticed in the media area. In the telecommunications area, which I think is another very exciting area, we're seeing telecommunications connecting people. So before too long, if not now, it would be possible to get an education anywhere in the world at any time. You can be connected by satellite or whatever. One recent example of sort of being on call, if you would, or being able to be contacted 24 hours a day, I was with my wife in a local department store, and she was trying on clothes or whatever, doing some shopping, and I was just kind of standing around waiting, and overheard a conversation of a doctor talking to her nurse. Shortly after that, she was talking to the patient's parent, and then next thing I knew, she was prescribing drugs. And all this happened within 5-10 minutes in a department store. So just think of that and the impact that that will have for, in this case, professional, but also for educational purposes. That I'm not suggesting that we go to school in a department store, but in your home, in your office. Even now, people are listening to audio in their automobile to get education for salespeople that travel a lot. So I see the whole explosion of telecommunications technology, and not that I believe in it all or that I want it all. I don't wear a beeper or anything like that, but if I wanted to, I could, and certainly with email, if you consider that part of telecommunications, it's possible to get people more quickly than even it is today trying to call them on the telephone.
There's in the last few years, there's been a real movement in our field for a number of reasons, a move away from education, if you will, to an area where business and industry has really embraced our field. I guess my question is, talk a little bit about the issue of the whole issue of business and industry, and our struggles between being in schools of education versus being in schools of business, and where do we fit in this?
Okay, I want to respond to that in a couple of ways. One, I think we're seeing business and industry working more with education at all levels. And unfortunately, I think that's an indictment that as public schools, we're not training people who can go out and go on the job, even if it's on an assembly line or in an office or whatever. So I think that's one of the reasons that education is, either willingly or not so willingly aligning with business and industry, because business and industry has been able to get the job done and realize that in some cases education hasn't, and it's a whole lot of reasons, and I'm not trying to do indictments here, but for one reason, public schools have not been able to afford the equipment, whether it's production equipment, computer equipment, or whatever. So that's one of the reasons that I think we're seeing business and industry more involved in education at the K-12 level, and certainly we're seeing it at the undergraduate level. If we move to our field in terms of what graduate students might do, where the needs, the demands are, it's a difficult question. I sat with many doctoral students, particularly even master's students. What do they want to do? Do they want to, maybe they've come from K-12 schools. They want to go back to K-12 schools. Do they want to teach at the university if they're getting a doctorate? Do they go into business and industry? And it's not an easy answer. It's not a single answer for everyone. I think each individual has to look at what you want to do. I encourage my graduate students to get experience in business and industry if they haven't been there. I encourage them to get experience at the college and university level if they think they might want to teach there. Rarely would you have a person at a graduate level that might want to go into public school education that hasn't already taught. So they've got those experiences. And then it's a matter of sitting down and assessing yourself. And as I said earlier, be true to yourself. Follow your instincts. And it's a set of trade-offs, as most things are in life. From my perception, in academia, you have a lot of freedom and flexibility. But you give up salary for that. And so, how important is the salary, the financial thing? And if that's your main priority, and there's nothing wrong with that, then obviously business and industry is where you're going to be able to make more money in a shorter period of time. And so it's a difficult question, and I would never give a student an answer. I would listen, ask questions, help them collect the data that will allow them to make the decision that's best for them, and realizing that in today's world, you're not locked into that decision for the rest of your career. In many of our parents' days, or certainly our grandparents' days, somebody went to work for a company and probably worked there 40, 50 years until they retired. But today we're not seeing that. So that first decision is not as critical as it might once have been, but still it's a very important decision.
The actual graduate programs in instructional systems there seems to be a national debate, or there's a concern. Do we stay in colleges of education? Do we move into business schools?
Okay, I guess I really don't think that it matters in general. I think, again, you look at the local environment, very similar to graduate students deciding, do I go into academia or business and industry? You have to decide for yourself. And so I think as academic programs, we need to do the same thing. Where can we be most successful? Where can we make the most impact? And so I would have no objections being in the School of Business or School of Technology. So again, I don't think it's where you are, but what you're able to do. It's like a rose is a rose is a rose. And so I realize it's an important question, but not one that I feel I could, say in every case we should do it this way.
I think it's a very elementary question that comes up, but I think it's an important one. Is how would you define instructional systems?
My first word comes out of my mouth would be systematic, and I had a teacher once that said you should never use a circular definition, so I'll try to not use instruction or systems in trying to describe it for you. I think it's the process of going about analyzing the situation, and this is going to be an educational or training situation, in terms of what are the resources available, what are the people that are available, who is the audience, what do you want them to accomplish as a result of this intervention, and then going through the process of analyzing, looking at all the various alternatives, options to bring that about. And one of the things that I think that has really made a big impact in the instructional systems area, it goes back to the days of program instruction, is trying it out with students. So find out who your learners are, try it out, revise it until it works, and then continue to monitor it to be sure that it works. And I think if we applied that to all of education, particularly K-12 education, we could make a tremendous impact. But I'm aware that a lot of materials using K-12 are never tried out with students. The first time a student sees the materials when they're handed the textbook or given the CD in the classroom.
A little earlier you talked about working with graduate students and giving some advice for graduate students. And you also mentioned that graduate students, if they don't have an opportunity to teach, should teach with a faculty member. Talk about teaching strategies with graduate students.
This is something I feel very strongly about. I've hopefully influenced some of my faculty that I work with at Purdue in that way, and I was talking to others and doing presentations at conferences and such, trying to bring about a situation where graduate students are taught or are brought into the situation and as equals. And I think as I look at some of my colleagues at Purdue outside of my educational technology area, but other areas of School of Education, certainly as I look in some of the other disciplines, the graduate students are sort of the gophers or the flunkies doing the grunt work, as some people would say it. And to me, that's not the kind of experience you want as a graduate student, but you want to negotiate with a professor that you can do everything the professor does. And that's something that I've done for years with the graduate students that I've had the pleasure of working with, that we sit down and decide what needs to be done, and then who does it is sort of dividing up the load rather than, well, that's a fun thing, I want to do it as the professor, or I don't really want to do that, you do it as a graduate student. So, for example, if we use videotapes or whatever, and they're over in another building, so some days I'm going to be out that way, I'll go pick up the videotape. Other days, the graduate student will pick up the videotape. We try to divide the presentations, I don't want to call it lecture anymore, but that communicates the idea of what happens in class, coordinating the activities. We try to divide that equally. And as I see it, that's alone is a win-win-win situation. It makes my load easier because I don't have to do all the preparation and everything. It's a tremendous learning experience for the graduate students, and the students in the class just love it because it's a trade-off, sort of a Mutt and Jeff kind of thing, that just like you have paragraphs in books in a presentation, you can have change of pace, paragraphing if you would, by the professor teaching for 5-10 minutes and then the graduate student stepping in doing the same kind of things for 5-10-15 minutes and then switching back. Grading the same way, that in the class I teach, we divide the projects in half. I grade half, the graduate student grades half, and early on I detected situations where students would sometimes play the instructor against the graduate student, sort of like kids do with parents, you know, pitting one against the other. And so to put a stop to that right away, in working with a graduate student at that time, we came up with the rule, if you would, that the student first had to go to talk to the person who graded it. And then if that didn't work out, and then the other party would be brought in. So for example, if I graded something and the student was upset, they couldn't go cry on the shoulder of the graduate student. They had to come to me first and talk to me why I gave them that grade or why I reacted the way that I did. And then if they weren't happy, then they could go talk to the graduate student, or usually we would sit down as a threesome. And in almost every case, I can only think of maybe one or two in 10-15 years I've been doing that didn't solve the problem or alleviate the concern to everyone's satisfaction, particularly the student. And if it really comes down to a decision that has to be made, then I, as the instructor, am forced to make it because I am the instructor of record, if you would. But it's just that it's a collegial relationship among the graduate student, the students in the course, and the professor.
The coming where you've spent most of your career at Purdue in that part of the country, and when you've had an opportunity to have a little time off, and you chose it to come to Florida State. Why would you? What motivated you to come, join our family down here, if you will?
I can honestly say it, and nobody's paying me, if you would. I had a chance for a sabbatical a couple years ago, and looked around, deciding where I wanted to go, and I really didn't have a particular mission or goal in mind to accomplish a certain thing. If I'd had a goal or an objective, if you would, accomplish a certain thing, then I might have gone to a place I could best do that. But I was looking just to contribute to the field, to do things and interact with people who could help me move forward in my career. And I, at that time, chose Florida State because as I looked around the country, I didn't find any other program in the country that had as many top people as Florida State did. You can go to other individual programs, you got some very, very fine people there, but in many cases there's 1, 2, or 3 of them where if you come to Florida State, there are probably 8 or 10 people who are tops in their field, and they're also, contrary to some programs, they're not just in one area. You have people in a variety of different interest areas, and so I came here, was happy during the sabbatical, and so now that I'm on a phased retirement or working part-time, I chose to come back here. The fact that it doesn't get ice and snow in the winter, have to admit was a factor, but that alone would not have attracted me to Florida State.
Well, I appreciate your time here. Do you have any final comments or thoughts for not only the students who might be looking at this from other programs, but students 10 years from now?
Oh, wow. I guess, we've said a lot of things that I wanted to say. I guess one other thing comes to mind, particularly as you're designing instruction or as you're teaching, and this is something that I learned from Sam Postlewaite when I went to work for him back in 1970, and I keep it in mind as I'm designing materials today or as I'm teaching a class, and that is, don't give the students answers for which they have no questions. If you think about that a little bit, like a lot of professors, and we've all been in classes with these professors that do just that. They give you answers and you don't even know what the question is. And so I think one of the things we're seeing in student-centered learning, in collaborative learning, cooperative learning, and all those kind of things is to develop the right questions, and then the student will find the answers. In most cases, the professor doesn't have to give the answers. An example of that is working with graduate students deciding on a career. I don't look at a graduate student and say, Dan, you ought to go to business and industry. In fact, you ought to go to work for Motorola. No, that's not my role as a professor. My role is to get you to ask the right questions, collect the data, and come up with your own answer. And I think that applies whether you're in kindergarten or whether you're just finishing your doctoral program.
Great. Well, we appreciate your time on this, and thank you very much.
Well, I've certainly enjoyed doing it, and look forward to seeing the final product.
Very good.
Was that what you wanted?
Outstanding.